Hello, NAAIA community. Get ready to relive insightful discussions, gain fresh perspectives, and be inspired by the wealth of knowledge our community has to offer. Let's dive into another episode.
Good morning and afternoon, esteemed guests, colleagues, and friends. It is an honor to welcome you to the first Agent Roundtable discussion for 2025 on behalf of the National African American Insurance Association. Today, we will be unpacking the very serious but timely topic of workplace violence and insurance solutions. As a disclaimer, for anyone who may have experienced a workplace violence event, we offer you this courtesy warning about content based upon today's topic. You may hear personal accounts or scenarios about harm or potential threats. If this is triggering in any way, we ask you to please take appropriate measures to care for yourself. I want to thank all of you for being present for NAAIA's first event of 2025. It is always a pleasure to be amongst peers, especially when we come together to learn from our industry experts. Though we are happy to be here, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the recent passing of Mr. Brian Thompson, United Healthcare's CEO. This was a tragic and recent reminder that workplace violence is real, and our discussion today is needed to ensure we understand our roles, the crucial needs of our products, and the reality of our current environments. The insurance industry is not immune to violent events. Though we may think we are uniquely positioned or prepared, an event like what we will be discussing today can seemingly come out of the blue. Please know that today's discussion will not be all doom and gloom. We do have the pleasure of listening to three experts on what we are doing right, innovative ideas coming down the pipeline, and actionable steps to ensure we are as prepared as possible should such an event transpire. Today, we amplify the voices of three extraordinary professionals who are considered experts across their industries on our topic. Each of them has had a compelling journey and testimonies for the need of this important work as we hope to create a safer future. Our panel will share their stories, insights, and experiences during our discussion and field questions from the audience as we hope to create an engaging conversation with today's attendees. To lead us through this timely conversation, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Precious Norman Walton, our Agent Program Manager at NAAIA. With her depth of experience and commitment to delivering needed and valuable programming, Precious is the best facilitator for today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Precious to the screen as we begin our discussion today. Precious, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Travis, and welcome everyone. NAAIA family, so good to be here with you again in 2025, kicking off our Agent Roundtable, just one of the many offerings that we are bringing to you for the agent engagement content here with NAAIA. So I appreciate every last one of you from joining all around the country. Hopefully everyone's staying warm. So we have assembled a powerhouse of knowledge, subject matter expertise as it pertains to this very difficult discussion to have. As agents and brokers and risk managers and trusted advisors, we're often put in these positions of having to explain to our insureds what the emerging risks look like so that they're prepared to prevent, to mitigate, to avoid, to take whatever precautions necessary for these events that are just becoming more and more prevalent. And so to help us have this discussion, we're glad to be joined by these panelists again and jump right into this conversation. I'd also like to remind you that as part of our agent engagement program, we do have affinity partnerships that are in place. And so we are glad to have one of our affinity partners with us today, Chubb Insurance. And so Paul Morissette with Chubb Insurance would like to just get some welcome remarks, again, just kicking off one of the many events that we're going to have throughout the year. And we'll be sharing more information on how this program is going to continue to evolve. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us today as well.
Thank you, Precious, and good morning and good afternoon to those of you out there. Just before we get to the main event here, I just wanted to take an opportunity to welcome everybody here on behalf of Chubb. Chubb has been a partner of the Agent Affinity Program with NAAIA for nearly 5 years now. And we just want to reaffirm to everybody that if there is a need in your agency to have access to Chubb, your membership in NAAIA does give you that capability. So you can contact either Jephthah or Precious, and they can let you know how to get in touch with the right folks in order to make that happen. So if you hear something today about the industry-leading coverages that Chubb offers relative to workplace violence from our leader in that area, and that's something that would appeal to you, we can hook you up with access or access to all of our other personal and commercial insurance products. Thanks again for being here today, and thank you, Precious.
Thank you so much, Paul. So we will go ahead and bring our subject matter experts to the table so we could jump into this conversation. Again, the more we are aware, the more we educate and elevate our agent force, the better advocates we can become for our clients, for our communities, and for all the places that we have influence. And so we will start off with a round of introductions so that you can understand exactly the width and the breadth of expertise that these experts bring to the conversation, and then we'll start sharing out this valuable information. So just going in order, top of my screen here, Chris, if you can just start us off with an introduction. Paul started to introduce you, but you know, of course, no one can tell your story like you, so I'll allow you to kick off your introduction, please.
Well, thank you so much, Precious, and thank you for inviting me to the conversation today. Chris Arehart with Chubb Insurance. I'm a Senior Vice President and First Party Product Manager for North America. Under my responsibilities are products such as commercial crime, financial fidelity bonds, kidnap and ransom, as well as workplace violence, sometimes called active shooter insurance. Been with the company for, 25 years this year. And I started right out of school, and it's just been a great experience. I never thought that 25 years later I'd be doing insurance, but it got its hooks in me, and I just never left. So thank you for having me speak today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll kick this over to Keith. If you can give an introduction, let the people know what your background is and how you'll be part of this conversation.
Sure. Hi, my name is Keith McGlen. I'm the Vice President of Security and Emergency Management for Carle Health. I've been in healthcare security for about 30 years. So I've worked in a couple of healthcare organizations across the country. And we've done a lot over the years in terms of showing up our emergency management and workplace violence programs to address the emerging trends in our industry.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Malcolm, if you can let the crowd know who you are, those that don't already know.
Last and certainly least, thank you, Precious. Malcolm McGuire. I work for Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, Texas. I'm an inspector in the police department, although I toggle between the police department and risk management at this point. But my responsibilities include investigating and assessing any threats to anything having to do with SMU. Honestly, we have multiple campuses in multiple states, but that also includes workplace violence. I work very closely with our human resources department and in dealing with issues that involve employees. I am just tickled to be here on a NAAIA panel discussion, given that I did spend 6 years as an SIU investigator for a couple different carriers. So there will be some faces and some names that I know on here, but thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you for accepting the call to have this discussion. Since this was planned last year and put on the calendar to date, there have been multiple instances of violence around the country. Not getting into all of the specifics, these are things that have happened in public venues and private venues, and there's so many different levels in terms of what happens before an event, during an event, and post-event. So for the first question, I'm actually going to direct it to you, Malcolm. When we think about these locations that things can happen, what is it that as a trusted advisor, as a risk professional, we can encourage our insureds to do to have some safeguards or a plan in place, you know, when the unimaginable, which unfortunately has become the inevitable, a little bit starts to unfold?
So I think you hit on it initially with the word plan. It's very important for everyone to have some sort of policy in place. Policy is loosely used when talking about insurance, but I'm talking specifically about a workplace violence prevention policy. But the second thing that I would bring up are training. right? And so I think that one of the biggest banes of our existence is having to do the mundane, having to do the trainings, the active shooter trainings, pretty much any training that has to do with us leaving our seat and going and participating in activities. But those are the kinds of things that can save a life, right? So I would encourage everyone to institute some sort of training, whether it's active assailant or something to do with domestic violence training, something that's done, I would say, a couple times a year, to be honest with you, just given turnover and bringing new people in. But it's important that people know what to do when something happens, and so that when something happens, that's not your first time dealing with it. So preparedness would be my simple answer.
Excellent point. And Keith, I know that this is something that is very near and dear, unfortunately, to our healthcare community as far as an uptick in the incidence of violence that happens in that context. So, we talked about, policies, plans, procedures, having something in place prior to the day of, what are some best practices and things that you've seen that the healthcare side has implemented to assist when these things happen?
As many on this call probably know, that healthcare has a disproportionate amount of workplace-related violence over and above other industries. And so definitely, as Malcolm indicated, having a solid policy in place that is risk-based. So it's based on the risk that healthcare organization faces. That policy is used to address those risks as well. And then training of team members. And so we train our team members, our employees, to be able to recognize the early warning behavioral signs that are prelude to violent behavior, and how to respond appropriately as a team to ensure that everyone is safe. And also really understanding how threats are communicated and how they're assessed, to understand, do we have a greater problem? So really having a targeted violence threat assessment process in place, where trained individuals are able to look at what's been articulated in terms of a threat and understand where that behavior falls on the threat spectrum, to understand, do we have an individual who's progressing through the targeted violence spectrum where it results in attack event as well. So really having that training program in place, having solid policies and procedures, working with local police as well to ensure that they understand the organization, the layout, and the policies and procedures, and really getting some input as well in respect to how we can proactively address workplace-related violence.
Got it. That makes tons of sense. Now, Chris, from a kind of an underwriting perspective, how helpful is it when you have an organization who's seeking coverage to help mitigate, losses and respond to these sort of losses, when they have their documents together? I know, for example, with employment practice liability, we like to see copies of their employee handbook. When it comes to this space, what sort of documents? I think, Keith mentioned it as well as Malcolm, some of those guidelines on how the training rolls out. But is there anything that from the carrier perspective would make a risk more ready or more favorable to offer coverage to?
Sure. In terms of preparedness, I couldn't agree more with Malcolm and Keith. In the healthcare industry has already had those requirements for workplace violence prevention policies in place for some time, but other locations and other jurisdictions are starting to come forward with additional laws. For example, in California, SB 553 is a law that everyone should understand and know on this call. If you have any employer that has 10 employees or more at any location in California, they are required by law under Cal OSHA to have a written policy and procedure that the people at that location had a voice in. So it's just simply not enough to throw a webinar up and make people click the buttons. So what we're looking for as underwriters is companies that are aware of these requirements. They may not have everything ready, and that's okay. But they want to see an awareness that, yes, I do understand that I need to have a policy and procedure, and I have it written. I have a policy and procedure against violence in the workplace, but I also have one against weapons in the workplace. Now, I'm not speaking, this is not a pro or anti, gun discussion. However, the ability and the prevalence of a weapon in the workplace will statistically lead to the probability of, and I'm an underwriter, so I talk probabilities of a violent event occurring. Having a policy and showing an underwriter, hey, we don't allow weapons in the workplace, not only allows them to tell that to their customers, employees, but also to take action. So they can involve outsiders. They can enforce that policy to protect the employees. An underwriter would be looking for those types of awarenesses, and then partnering with them to help the customer get those trainings. So you mentioned at the beginning the roles and needs and products in the introductions. Insurance has a place in that, and insurance professionals bring their awareness and bring their knowledge to help the customer make those connections. So you may not know how to, as Keith and Malcolm were talking about, speak with the local law enforcement. You may not know who to contact or how to contact them. Insurers, it's in our best interest to get you those trainings, get you the connected with the experts that can help in a crisis, because no company in America or the world is qualified on their own to handle all of their matters. It just simply isn't possible. So an underwriter is looking for companies that will buy in and say, yes, I want that training. I want to take advantage of those loss control tactics, so that we can, I say this with all due respect to the industry, I never want to pay a claim. And it sounds weird to say, but I never want to pay a claim, because I never want to have a loss, because a loss here is a tragedy.
Absolutely.
But what I do want to do is get people that coverage for those incidences that we can prevent, the threats. That's where most of our claims are actually come from, is in the threat management space. So that's some insight for the folks on the phone in terms of the insurance underwriter and what's in our mindset.
Absolutely. Thank you for those nuggets. You said something that really resonated with me when I first got started in the risk management field. A mentor of mine told me that risk management is teaching someone how to walk the tightrope, and insurance is the safety net should they fall. But the only thing better than a good safety net is learning how to not fall.
I like that.
And so, when we talk about training that is not just, one of those routine, click the boxes and checking it and putting it into practice. I'm of that age. I'll raise my hand and say, I remember, in grade school, we had fire drills, depending on what part of the country we're in, you may have had tornado drills where you went into the hallway and, kind of learned how to put your head down, in case of that sort of thing. But Malcolm, when it comes to really walking this out, how do you turn a policy into like on-site training? What is effective? Is it a full-on simulation? Is it something that, as far as best practices, videos, what have you seen in your history of both law enforcement as well as threat prevention?
I will tell you, thank you for that question. I'll tell you that the most effective thing, and it may just be because people don't want to sit and click through stuff, are case studies. I think case studies are some of the most, because it involves a certain level of practical application, but it shows real time. It shows real examples of things that have happened. And unfortunately, over the last few years, we have far too many case studies to choose from. But I think that that's going to be what stimulates more than anything else, because if the case study is followed by discussion, right, a roundtable like we're doing now, you'll get to see all of these different viewpoints. And a lot of people are hesitant to either present case studies or to participate in them, because it exposes a certain level of insecurity. Comes to, are we doing things the right way, right? Or the shoulda, woulda, couldas come into play. But when you hold tight to the fact that the purpose is to learn, the purpose is to educate, and the purpose is to keep people safe, you usually end up with a good result. But case studies, I mean, you can't beat them in terms of lived experiences and learning how things went and what you could do better. So that's those are my go-to. And I'm not saying that because I present a lot of case studies. Unfortunately, I've just had a lot of experience in a lot of certain different areas to where I've had the chance to learn from people I'm presenting case studies to, but also to educate to a certain extent. So you can't beat a case study.
Thank you for that. And same thing, Keith, when we talk about how do you walk this out, I remember some years ago, I was working at a large corporation, and we would have the quarterly drill. They would announce it to us ahead of time, so nobody, decided to be a hero. And it was this really cheesy, oh my gosh, they used to put someone like in this like neon shirt, and they'd have the word intruder like across their chest. And it felt like we were playing Pac-Man. Like they would chase us around the building. You go to the left, you go to the right, it was just so terribly executed. It was just like, some calisthenics for the office. Like, oh, today's the day we get to run from the guy in the shirt. I think a lot of times when we look at this, we assume that it's some sort of external threat. We assume that some, stranger danger, was tailgating and in the door when someone didn't have a badge. But, that's not always, the case. And so if you can kind of speak to a little bit from your experience, where the threats are and how do we actually roll it out in a way that doesn't put people in a panic, but gives them that situational awareness that they need to figure out, what is report worthy.
Sure. So I believe that the best success that I've seen is to use a variety of mechanisms to educate and train our employee base. So we use computer-based training. That's an annual training that provides some level of awareness in terms of workplace violence and how to report events that are potentially violent or actually violent as well. And then we do the simulations as well with training with our armed intruder situation where we bring team members in, much like a tabletop drill to kind of discuss our response to ensure that team members are able to work through some of the stages of an armed intruder situation. But we also teach our team members that we have external threats, but we have internal threats as well. And we teach our team members, it's actually in our policies, about the duty to warn. That when an individual is articulating threats or have what we call behaviors of concern, these are typically these pre-incident indicators where behaviors of concern are being exhibited. And one-offs don't necessarily mean that there's going to be a potential issue of violence, but when we have these cluster of behaviors that are together, that team members are required to report to our security team members who are trained to assess threats, to understand exactly where that behavior falls on the threat spectrum and to implement a process to ensure that everyone's safe. So I believe that having a variety of methods to train our team members, some people are visual learners, some people are able to, do the annual training on computer and they've got it, but having training throughout the year and keeping at the forefront that we want to make sure that our organization is safe and that everybody has a part in this. And, we use the motto that security is everyone's responsibility. It's just not the people who are walking around with uniforms and tasers, but it's everyone's responsibility to ensure that we have a safe environment. And we continue to push that message each and every day, each and every month, every quarter, and every year to our team members.
That's good. Thank you so much for that. So just a reminder to those who are following the conversation that we do have the Q&A box available. So if you have a specific question for any of our panelists, go ahead and weigh in there, and we'll go ahead and share that question out so that we can get your questions answered. Because this tends to be a very large, dense, heavy conversation. And for many of us that work in the small commercial space, for example, there's that conversation that we have with a prospect when insured to let them know that they have an exposure, but then the solution, piece of it, because there's so many different pieces in terms of, we talked a little bit about how do we try to prevent, so the preventative side of it, but when an incident actually occurs. So Chris, if I can ask you to kind of share, just from a response perspective, what really differentiates this kind of product from like maybe commercial general liability?
Great question. From an insurance perspective, workplace violence expense insurance is generally an expense product. It can be found in a liability context, and there can be specialty liability carriers that add in some general liability related to an active event. However, most policies are expense reimbursement, and they're intended to fill gaps in between different products. So you mentioned general liability, and general liability is you're going to respond to that liability event. However, it may fall short when it comes to the threat management component. So the expenses associated with dealing with that threat, if there's been no liability moment, which, as I mentioned in my previous answer, we want them all to be threats, not actions. Liability is always after the fact. So right out the gate, it misses that preventative aspect that Keith and Malcolm were discussing, and that we want everyone to really focus in on in this conversation. So general liability kind of falls down in that. So sure, if you get sued, there's liability response for that, but that's outside of my realm. There are other policies though that one might think of, and many might apply. It's like a puzzle piece. We have a marketing piece that we have that has puzzle pieces of different pieces, and workplace violence expense filling in the gaps. Property insurance, for example. Property insurance addresses the exposure of a building being not able to be occupied. But for example, in when the shooting that happened in Aurora, Colorado, many years ago, many people are not aware that the building needs to be shut down. People were not going back to that movie theater for quite some time. The building is fine. So business interruption, you can go back to work. There's no problem with the building. But what happened at that building is the challenge. So looking to the BI and then finding out, wait a minute, we can't open and there's no coverage for all my lost income. Moving into the, you say a property, you have BI, we have employment practices related policies. Many of these events involve other employees or employees' spouses, or you bring your problems into work. We all live at work, even with work at home, where people are back in offices. Employment practices policies deal with that harassment, threat, etc., but have strong bodily injury exclusions or extensions for this type of thing that are very, very narrow. Some cost for some security guards, and that's about it. And then finally, the last one is work comp. So workers' compensation gets brought up as well. There's been an event, someone's been injured. There's mental distress, mental anguish, a big component of these matters. Workers' compensation only addresses generally, and these are all generalizations. We have a 50-state framework and the district. So generally only addresses the injuries that an individual faces related to their work. So the individuals that may have been injured, first of all, may not even be employees, maybe guests or other business partners. But more importantly, the people that are physically injured are one thing, but if you're mentally injured because of the event, work comp generally is going to say, no, that has nothing to do with your work. You were not injured doing work, which I think is a travesty, but be that as it may, that is the nature of those policies. So as trusted advisors on the phone, it's important to share with a customer that there are these gaps, but they can be filled by specialty products that are built to say, okay, this is a thing. Let's build something that fits into those gaps. And for the small commercial customers, it is a surprisingly affordable, product and a peace of mind product that you'd be surprised at how easily it can be added into a risk management portfolio for a small business.
So I love how you shared that the graphic that you have, which really illustrates how a lot of coverages dovetail into one another. And so, as we talk about workplace violence, it really is an area that touches on several different parts of the organization. There's a human resource element to this, there's a medical element to this, there's our, duty owed to, the public, and just all of these things that really start to come together. And it kind of puts me in the mindset of, even like with cyber response, that you have some first party coverages, which are for the expenses, because now you owe, whether it be credit monitoring or whatever, versus on the back end, the third party, if you're deemed liable for something. So in the moment where something has occurred, whether it be on campus, on site, whatever the case may be. So Malcolm, this is my question for you. What is kind of the gold standard in terms of how do you put together a plan? Is this something that small organizations, they may not have the bandwidth to have someone come in and create a customized plan for their work site? Are there general resources that are available? For example, it was referenced earlier, in the state of California, you have the mandate from OSHA, and that's the question that we have from our audience as well, if we're aware of any other states that have workplace violence training. So mandates and resources.
So I'll tackle what I know about the mandates one first. I will say the state of Texas, as of September 1st of 2024, does require healthcare facilities to have a workplace violence prevention program. Unfortunately, I can't speak to everyone else, but for healthcare facilities, I'm sure Keith would be happy about that. They do require it in Texas as well. In terms of resources, it's interesting because we're at a point now where everyone is, I hate to say it this way, but everyone's an expert, right? So we are seeing people pop up all over the place, whether it's on LinkedIn or all these other social media sites who are quote unquote experts on workplace violence or corporate security, things like that. And it's unfortunate that you have to weed through it. But there are plenty of resources. There is an organization called the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and I can forward you a link later that deals specifically with behavioral threat management, behavioral threat assessment and management. I've been a part of this organization for a couple of years now, and it is the who's who of threat management nationally and internationally. And when I say the who's who, you're going to have everyone from insurance professionals, law enforcement, behavioral health individuals, attorneys, corporate security, all weighing in on how threat management and threat assessment helps them in their individual daily lives and work lives. And so that's a huge resource. And I'm a little biased because I am vice president of South Central chapter, but the organization works. It works. And not only just for networking purposes, but being able to see how other people interact in the threat assessment space in ways that can benefit you in your profession, in your particular profession. So that's one major resource. And obviously your different states are going to have your different targeted violence prevention programs, but I would start there. I would start with Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, or ATAP as we like to call it.
Wonderful. And Keith, I'm glad that Malcolm mentioned that in Texas, it is a mandate for healthcare facilities. And I know that you're based in the Chicagoland area. Is the healthcare portion of it, is that something that's really across the board? And again, I'm not asking you to speak to something that you may not be privy to or familiar with, but are you seeing more and more that, whether it's state mandated or not, that the healthcare industry is getting in front of this?
Absolutely. So any hospital that's accredited by the Joint Commission is required to have a workplace violence program in place, including training as well as workplace violence committees that are actually looking at the data and making informed decision to address trends that are going in the wrong direction. So there are states that are mandating workplace violence, but healthcare organizations, as I said before, because we have a disproportionate amount of violence, have been in the forefront of workplace violence intervention programs for a very long time. And so, the training, the policies, procedures, are all hardwired into healthcare organizations in order for us to be effective in doing what we are designed to do, take care of the needs of the community. And it's difficult sometimes with the rising level of violence to operate in an environment like that as well. So that's why, again, there are requirements, recommendations in terms of how healthcare organizations should approach this as well. And to Malcolm's point, there are a lot of resources out there for individuals in other industries. ATAP, as Malcolm articulated, is a very, very good resource. There's also the American Society for Industrial Security. Again, they've got a workplace violence standard that is pretty generic in terms of organizations or industries that can be applied as well. So there are resources out here to really, really help individuals to formulate a policy and a plan to address issues of violence.
Thank you. I think that that's so important to know that there's guidance. You don't have to write this from scratch. You don't necessarily have to, bring someone in to put this together, that there are resources, which is, again, I think, Chris, you made that mention earlier that, that is part of what, as an industry, we aim to do. We don't, put out there that we are the end all be all of all things. We're part of a larger plan, a larger, practice that's in place to help shift and to transfer some of that loss when it does happen. And so we have another question from one of our audience members regarding a comment you made earlier. So we talked about how these coverages dovetail and that there's different carve outs. And we understand as insurance professionals that that's designed so that you don't have duplicate coverage, that no one's stepping on anyone's toes. So the question here is in regards to trauma and work comp, because oftentimes when an incident happens, it's witnessed by multiple people. So they may have, residual, after the fact PTSD type symptoms and things like that afterwards. So if work comp isn't the product to cover that, does the workplace violence policy offer any sort of relief as far as that goes?
Yes, the workplace violence policy is intended to step in and provide not only that emergency mental health response in terms of trauma counseling, but then should there be additional expenses associated with that trauma, that individual can be carried through and then partnered with their healthcare provider, should there be healthcare insurance or government program, wherever that fits. The workplace violence carrier is the one that works them and carries them through that process. Employers are also, unfortunately, they lean heavily on things like EAP programs. So, but EAP programs generally have fairly stringent limitations in terms of the total spend that would be available to any one employer for an event. I've personally seen multiple EAP programs, respond back with, "Sure, we can get you some mental health counseling. You have 1 hour." I'm sorry, but 1 hour is not going to work for any level of trauma. So I can speak to what my company provides because I know it the best, but obviously other carriers also have response firms. We approach this twofold. We have the security and facilities access piece, where we partner with a group called the Ackerman Group, independent company that provides that security and consulting work, threat management, et cetera, like Malcolm and Keith are mentioning. But also then we partner with a group called R3 Continuum, and they are a behavioral health network that really, it's like skip the line. I don't know about y'all, but trying to get in to see a counselor, especially in the wake of COVID, for my family has been a nightmare. Everyone's booked, no one's available, the line's out the door. Now imagine that you witnessed an event. Maybe it wasn't a full shooting, but there was just a beating at the location. We had an individual where he was fired and was very upset. This is often the case. This is a very typical response. The individual went home, got what amounted to a table leg, like a club, like a side, and took it out on the firing manager at 4:30 in the morning when the shift change happened in the parking lot. Put him in the hospital. And so people are obviously reacting heavily to this, tragic event. Fortunately, the hiring manager survived and was working through his injuries. But that's the type of thing. That's the most common, frankly, type of scenario. So those R3 Continuum group can provide that counseling session and get in and speak with those individuals within that first hour, which we would rather you getting on the phone and talking to somebody and then deploying out. It all starts telephonically versus, self-medicating.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And Malcolm, we talked about, of course, I remember, again, of that age, I'm telling my age a lot here, that, some years ago, we would see that there was a high number of these sort of things playing out in postal facilities. And so, there was a term that was used years ago, it was going postal, right? Because you're like, when somebody, when these things erupt, but now we're seeing these in grocery stores, on college campuses, we're seeing these in all sorts of venues kind of that span the gamut. When it comes to securing, for example, the college campus, are there any other considerations that come up when it comes to identifying those that may have been, impacted and offering services, or how do you get in touch with someone who may have suffered some sort of, loss related to an event?
So I'm fortunate. Thank you for that. On the campus that I work, there are plenty of resources. Keith actually alluded to this a little bit in some of his first comments when he talked about something we call the pathway to violence. And the pathway is essentially a model that describes the stages a person may go through before committing a violent act. And everyone here, regardless of age and generation, has heard the phrase "see something, say something," right? Or some variation of that. And it's what's helpful is when people actually embrace that. But getting back to the training aspect, I think it's important for people to learn. And there's 5 or 6 steps involved in the model for the pathway to violence to help you get an understanding of what you're looking at, right? So even in this generation of students who are, constantly looking down at their phone as opposed to looking a person in the face or being aware of their surroundings. If you learn specific things or certain things to look for in behavior, it'll be easier to make that determination. And going back to the case studies example, I've been fortunate to participate in a lot of different conferences and things like that where I've met and talked to victims of past targeted violence. And one of the main things that they'll always say is, "I wish I had paid attention to this person prior to," right? And that works not only on the college campus, but in your office building. And dealing with your insureds as well. So it sounds very cliche, but see something, say something is a real thing. And situational awareness, as I was alluding to the other day, Precious, is paramount. So in terms of that, when it comes to how things come to my attention, for example, here on the college campus, it is from various sources, but typically because someone saw or heard something that concerned them, and they used a plethora of ways to get that information to my office.
So I'm gonna stick with you just for a moment,
Sure.
Mel, because you have an SIU background. And as a former property adjuster, whenever we'd make a referral out to SIU, you had to be able to tie it back to these indicators from the NICB, so the National Insurance Crime Bureau. So it wasn't enough to say, hey, this person's suspect, I think he's lying. You had to be able to point back to and say, okay, they asked for settlement too quickly. They were unable to provide documents. So I know that, especially in the environment that we're in now, that everyone's got something on their mind, right? How would somebody differentiate what is like reporting worthy in this culture where everyone is kind of, team mind my own business?
So I don't want to say the opposite of what I'm sure some carriers, SIUs are saying these days. One of the things that allowed me to achieve a certain amount of success, and because I did some property a little bit. I think I've actually worked with a couple of people who might be on this call in the past, but specifically workers' comp. I did a lot of workers' comp investigations out in California. And one of the things that I would tell a lot of the adjusters, because they would ask me the same thing, and yes, some of them had that sixth sense, that radar, where they say, I think this person's lying. I said, awesome, spidey sense is great, but that's not enough, right? So, but I don't want to deter anyone from making those calls, making those referrals anyway. Let the investigative professional determine whether or not it's needs to be verified, and go from there. But I don't want anyone to sit on information that they may have that could be useful. I'll say the same thing for workplace violence prevention. If you feel like something is not right, you need to tell someone and let the quote unquote professionals figure out whether or not it's something that's actionable. But just don't hold on to it.
Got you. Thank you for that. And Keith, kind of same question in terms of reporting methods. So in the healthcare environment, especially with these large hospital systems, is there a hotline, a link? Like how does somebody who's overheard something or witnessed something make someone aware?
Well, in all of our hospitals, there's a 24/7 security department. And so we ask that team members would contact security directly if they feel that there is an event that requires security intervention. And one of the things, which goes in line with this, if you see something, say something. We teach our team members, if they see something, if they feel something, say something. Because at the end of the day, your instincts sometimes is a good predictor of a potential security related incident. And that's why we have that duty to warn concept in our policies, that you can report something and it could turn out to be nothing. And again, we don't make you feel bad about it because at the end of the day, we want you to be proactive in reporting. But at the end of the day, really, really ensuring that team members feel comfortable, that they feel empowered to say that I think that this is not right. I don't have all the information. I'm not the subject matter expert in terms of threat assessments, but I think that there may be something wrong here. And definitely, we follow up on that. And when team members are right in respect to their concerns, we absolutely support them and acknowledge their contributions to ensuring that we have a safe environment as well. So again, we have so many avenues, not only calling the security department directly, but in some healthcare organizations, they have an anonymous link where you can provide information regarding a situation, and it's investigated, as it were, by the security team as well. So again, anything emergent, we want them to call us directly so that we can respond in real time. But again, we've had a variety of ways that they can report information, and that's the best practices. If you just got one way to report stuff, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a blockage, as it were, to getting the information to the assessors. Having a variety of ways of reporting emergency and non-emergency information is very important.
It sounds like the resounding theme, that I'm hearing here, and I think one of you said it earlier, is that it's everyone's responsibility to be good stewards over our workplaces, our college campuses, our public places, and that no concern is too small because, as Randy said in the comments here, let the investigator make the determination on whether or not they pursue it, or, if it was something that was material or not. So we are coming to the end of our time together, gentlemen, and so I wanted to kind of a quick lightning round, round robin style here, where if there's one big takeaway so I already stole that one off the table, that is everyone's responsibility. What is it that you would encourage our agent and brokers that are tuning in today to be able to, what's that one nugget that they can go back and share with their prospects and their insured? So Chris, I'll start with you in terms of final thoughts and that one big takeaway.
Be comfortable talking about things that are uncomfortable. Have the conviction to know that this type of insurance, these types of matters, they do happen, but they're not determined that they will happen, but they could. And it's your responsibility to introduce your customer into this world of preparedness, because they're not going to find it themselves.
Got it. Thank you so much. And how can someone reach out to you, Chris, if they had any specific questions for you?
Absolutely. Find us through our affinity partnership with NAAIA first. Secondly, me personally, LinkedIn is a great source of connections. Got a lot of folks on there. Yeah, find me in both those places. Thank you again for having me.
Excellent. Keith, final thoughts, words of wisdom.
I would say, I guess, to sum up everything that I've said, we teach our employees in healthcare to have a questioning attitude. In other words, if things are not right, raise your hand and say, I don't feel safe, or I think that this situation is spiraling out of control. I need some help. Being proactive, being situationally aware of your surroundings and what's happening is something we teach our healthcare workers as well. So really, we live in a society that is becoming more and more dangerous, and to really be aware of your surroundings and get the decision makers, the people that can support you, involved early on is my advice.
Wonderful. And how can someone find you and reach out to you if they wanted to ask additional questions?
Sure. Through LinkedIn is the best way to connect to me, and I'll be more than happy to respond and answer your questions.
Wonderful. And thank you again for participating. Malcolm, final thoughts, words of wisdom for our team here.
I will piggyback on the proactive advice. I think that's super important, but situational awareness is always going to be top with me, just from not only my training, but just different experiences. And I think that's super important. And then the last thing that I'll say is, don't be afraid to bring in outside people to train. I think it's very important that those who are within your industry are knowledgeable, but at the same time, you can recognize that there are those who are, have some level of experience that's not only palatable but comparable to what you all are doing. So don't be afraid to bring them in, whether it's via Zoom like this, or I don't know if anyone's even in person anymore, but doing in-person trainings is always helpful. So and I'll throw my email in the chat, but I'm also easy to find on LinkedIn. So.
Wonderful. And thank you so much. So thank you all again for being so generous with your time, with your expertise. These are the types of conversations that are really timely and necessary, especially for our agent community. And so with that, again, this is our first kickoff event for 2025. I hope everyone found this to be very enlightening and informative, and that you've got some action items on your desk to go forward with.
Thank you for watching this flashback episode with NAAIA. We appreciate your time and hope you found the insights valuable. Stay tuned for more enriching content. Until next time, thank you for being a part of the NAAIA community.